So now that we've looked at a little bit about how screening relates to policy, I also like to have a little bit of a conversation about how screening relates to ethics. And there are a lot of different ways of thinking about this particular conversation, but I like to at least start with the four fundamental ethical principles. And so those four principles are the principle of respect for autonomy, the principle of beneficence or doing good, bringing about good, the principle of non-maleficence, which is the idea of first do no harm, and which ends up usually we sort of balance the good and the bad, and then this whole principle of justice or social justice or equality or fairness. And so let's think about each one of these in terms of how that relates to screening. The principle of autonomy means that people can make decisions for themselves. And so just because we have a screening tool does not necessarily mean that that person is going to be interested in having the screening tool for themselves. And so we need to respect each person's decision. Sometimes people don't want to have a screening test. There may be certain situations where they would really rather not know if they're going to come down with some kind of disease later in life, certain types of dementia that can be screened for earlier with genetic testing, but they just simply don't want to be burdened with that information. And we need to respect that. We need to allow people to make their own decisions for themselves based on what they know about what that screening test would do for them. The next one is to bring about good. And so the thing I like to think about in terms of beneficence is if we have a screening tool, then that particular screening tool needs to be able to pick up on the disease early in that non-clinical phase, the preclinical phase, and then be able to change the course of that person's illness. So bringing about good means that we need to actually have a positive impact. So then the principle of non-maleficence means first do no harm. We know that anything could possibly do harm to somebody. And so if we do a screening test and the screening test actually has negative impact on that person, then we need to be careful about that. This also plays into the whole idea of those false positives and false negatives. So if somebody gets a positive test result but it was wrong, that false positive, then they're having a lot of anxiety about that. And so it's up to us to develop tests that are good at not having false positives. On the flip side, if somebody has a negative test but it was incorrect, they actually do have preclinical disease that the screening test didn't pick up on, then we've given them a false sense of security. And so in that way we could sort of indirectly harm them by causing them to ignore symptoms that might happen in the future. So doing no harm is an important concept with screening. And then finally, the idea of justice. There are a lot of situations in life where people who are socially or financially more well off have more access to both the screening test itself and the resources to plug them into once that screening test comes back and says that they need help. And so we need to do what's required to help balance that out. Equality, fairness, impartiality, and not having unfair burdens on those who are at a disadvantage. And so that's just one way of thinking about the ethics of a screening test, and your textbook lists a lot of other different kind of important information. So kind of collect all of that up and think about screening tests, not just numerically what we can do, but also in terms of how we use those. Thank you for joining me for the ethics of screening.